May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So, here Jesus is at it again, telling stories, telling parables. He tells this parable of the wedding feast. And it can be a little disturbing in places. You don't show up to the wedding, you get killed and your city gets burned. You come to the wedding, you're not dressed right, you get thrown into the outer darkness. Well, what kind of good news is that? Does everybody here remember, probably from high school English, what an allegory is? Allegory? Well, if you don't remember, or even if you do, let me enlighten you. An allegory is a story in which the various elements of the story stand symbolically for other things. These various elements of people, the things, and what's going on. And they have a hidden or symbolic meaning. This parable, in reality, two parables, is an allegory. The first part of the parable, about the invited guests not showing up, actually makes one point. The second part of the parable, about the wedding robe, or lack thereof, makes a completely different point. So in reality, there are two different parables, both allegorical. The first one is very similar. It has exactly the same point as the gospel we heard last Sunday about the wicked tenants in the vineyard. In this story, the king, or in the case of last week, the vineyard, or the landowner, is God. The tenants, or the invited guests, are the religious leaders. The slaves are the prophets that are sent out by God to call his people back to him. The Son, of course, is Christ. This parable is all about what happens when we abandon, or when God's chosen people appear to abandon him. He says, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, if you're not going to follow what I am teaching you, now I'm going to go find somebody else. So he sends his slaves out again. This time, they call people from the streets. Anybody who they happen to run across. It doesn't matter whether they're good, bad, indifferent. Everybody is invited. So they come to the wedding banquet. Those people represent the people who had formerly been excluded from the religious life of Israel, the Gentiles. So God, basically in this parable, is saying to his chosen people who have chosen not to follow him, okay, if you're not going to be my guest, then I'll invite somebody else. So he sends the slaves out again. Now we come to the second parable about the wedding banquet. This parable makes a very different point. This parable, rather than being about what happens when God's chosen people abandon him, the second parable is about those who are invited, those who become the church. In this case, of course, the king is God still. The guests who are brought in from the street are the members of the church. Well, remember, when he sent the slaves out, they invited everybody in, both good and bad. So these are the people that we see sitting in the pews, the people we invite to come through our doors every Sunday. We don't care. We don't care whether you're good, bad, indifferent. Come to church with us. Come share with us. And there are people who do. They come regularly to church, but never really sinks in what it's all about. So, if this is an allegory, and the guests are members of the church, what is this wedding garment? What is this wedding robe that Jesus speaks of? Jesus doesn't really tell us, but given his reference to good and bad, and the fact that Matthew is extremely concerned with righteousness. He uses the word 23 times in his gospel. The wedding garment most likely represents righteousness. Okay? That's all very well and good. So if you're righteous, you're properly dressed. Okay, fine. So what does that mean? What does righteous mean? It's as if it's assumed that everybody knows what righteousness is. It doesn't have to be explained. And I think we all assume that we know what righteousness is. But I wanted to kind of pin it down a little closer. I mean, if I went out here and asked you, every one of you, to define righteousness for me, I would probably get at least 24 different answers. So what is righteousness? Is it about following rules? Is it about praying regularly? Going to church? Giving to charity? Working for justice? Are any of those things, or all of those things, righteousness? So I decided I'm going to find out exactly how this word is defined. I went to my old standby, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, which is, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's about that thick. And it answers just about any question you might have about the church, from beginning to end. And some questions that you didn't have until you started reading it. I looked for an entry in the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church for righteousness, or righteous. Guess what? It's not there. Not a word about it. Again, it seems to be assumed. Well, you all know what righteousness is. I don't need to explain it. So finally, I resorted to my second old standby, Noah Webster. And here's what Noah had to say about it. He defines righteousness as acting in accord with divine or moral law. Acting in accord with divine or moral law. Okay? That helps some. But exactly what is this moral, divine or moral law that we're supposed to conform to? Turns out to be pretty simple, actually. Not easy, but simple. Jesus summed it up very neatly when a Pharisee challenged him to name the greatest commandment. And Jesus responded, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment," he said. "But there is a second commandment that is like it. You shall love your neighbors as yourself." And he added these words, "On these two commandments hang all of the law and all of the prophets." Pretty simple, right? Love God, love your neighbor. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? Well, first we have to kind of explore what this word love means. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but it doesn't have anything really to do with emotion. It has to do with caring as much for someone else's welfare as you do for your own. So this is what we do. We love God first of all, and out of that love of God grows this love of neighbor, in which we serve our fellow children of God. So that, I think, is what we're talking about here, what Jesus is talking about when he talks of the guest without the wedding robe being kicked out. I don't think he really cared about how you dressed to come to church. It's probably a good thing. But he does expect us, once we do come through those doors, not to just sit in the pews and then go home and forget everything. He expects us to live a life of love. Love of God and love of neighbor. That's the wedding robe we are called to wear when we come through those doors, when we are baptized and confirmed. That's it. Love God, love your neighbors, and you'll be properly dressed. Long before Jesus came, the prophet Micah had this to say. I love this. It's essentially another summary of the law. And Micah said, in speaking to the people, he has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly